The Bible is nonsense. All you have to do is read through it, not even all the way one time, to realize that it's nonsense. Or is it? I'm going to take a few minutes here and explain why it might appear to be nonsensical. Maybe give a little bit of insight into kind of what's going on there. And I'm going to do so on my drive home. Actually, I'm leaving one of my local establishments to head home. And I don't have a fancy setup or anything like that in my car, so I'm just going to put the camera, hopefully this will work out. I'm going to put it in the armrest, or the hand rest thingy for the passenger, and hope that you guys can hear me okay. Hope that it works out, and we'll have some fun. I won't be looking at the camera while I'm driving, but I'll get a second here to get this set up. I've done this before and it didn't take this long to set up, so hopefully that'll stay put. Maybe, well, should stay put enough to accomplish what I want. So anyway, it'll be about a 10, probably 15 minute drive home, so I'm gonna hopefully this video won't be more than about 15 minutes. So anyway, why does the Bible, sometimes, especially when you read it maybe at face value, can seem pretty nonsensical, right? Oh, and if the camera that moves around a little bit, it's because I couldn't get it in there super securely. Shouldn't move around too much, but it might move around a little bit. So why does the Bible seem nonsensical? A lot of apparent contradictions, right? Maybe that's I've come to think that's perhaps one of the reasons why so many people think that the Bible is nonsensical, because there's so many contradictions, or apparent contradictions, right? In fact, I'll list one apparent contradiction right off the bat. This is found in 1 Peter, the book of 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Live as free people, but do not use your freedom." I'm going off of memory here. I had to pause there. I got a couple different verses mixed up. It's live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. What? That's a clear contradiction, right? We'll read it again. Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. That makes no sense, right? Live as free people, live as God's slaves. So it's nonsense, right? There's a lot of other scriptures I could mention that may seem nonsensical. Actually, one I will, or two actually, two in one kind of that I'll mention is there's one, I believe it's Proverbs 9, chapter 9, verse 10, I think it is. It says, "The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom." And yet, later on in 1 John 4:18, I believe it is, the book of 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 says, "There's no fear in love, for perfect love casts out all fears." So Proverbs 9:10, again, I think it's Proverbs 9:10, I could be wrong on that, but I believe it's 9:10, chapter 9, verse 10. Says, the fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. But then that 1 John 4:18 verse says, "There is no fear in love." So what's going on here? These are blatant contradictions, right? Maybe not. What if there's more to it than what we're seeing? What if there's a lot more to it than what we're seeing, in fact? A lot of different places I could go with this one, and there's other examples I could give, because even in my own reading of the Bible, I've come across many apparent contradictions that, after reading into it more, and sometimes even just taking a step back and saying, okay, what is the big picture of what's being portrayed here? What is God wanting to tell us? If you look at it from that perspective, things might start to make a little bit more sense. A lot of things in life seem to be contradictions until we realize perhaps what's being communicated. And I want to bring up the idea of a paradox. We're surrounded by paradoxes, and we may or may not even realize it. What is a paradox? A paradox essentially is two opposing or contradicting things that are actually in reality both true. We're surrounded by paradoxes. What are some examples? The more you spend, the more you save. I was actually looking at a list of common contradictions and common paradoxes. They seem contradictions, but they're it's a contradiction and yet true at the same time. I was looking at them. You can look them up on Google. There's actually quite a few of them. Off the top of my head, I'm not remembering a lot of them right now. But we're surrounded by contradictions, or by paradoxes, contradictions as well, because they seem to contradict each other, but yet somehow they're both true. Paradoxes mess with our brain. Or at least they can easily mess with our brain. Another paradox I'll mention from the Bible is that Jesus Christ is fully human and fully God. That's impossible, right? You can't be fully human and fully God. Can you? I can't be, because I'm a human. God made me. I can't be. But it's easy to look at verses like, I believe it's John 1:14. There's others elsewhere. Off the top of my head, I know a lot of them, but I don't remember exactly where most of them are. There's just a few that I know where they are. But John 1:14 is one of them. John 1:14 says, "The Word became flesh." In other words, God became flesh. "The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth." So there's some apparent contradictions here that to our human mind, they seem like contradictions. Our human mind sometimes struggles with paradoxes, because paradoxes, in a way, to our human mind, they don't make sense. They defy our logic. And it seems like the fact that I feel like I've gathered that one of the reasons why so many people think the Bible is nonsensical and untrue is because it has so many such apparent contradictions. And maybe there are some cases where it does have contradictions, and yet both things are simultaneously true. Like that 1 Peter 2:16, the first example that I mentioned, 1 Peter chapter 4, or I'm sorry, 1 Peter chapter 2, verse 16. It says, "Live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves." Live as free people, live as God's slaves. That's a contradiction. It doesn't make sense. Unless slavery to God is freedom. What do I mean by that? There's a lot of places I could go with this. A lot of avenues I could take. A lot of different pieces of the puzzle that I could share that illustrate the truth as a whole. I'll list two examples that kind of illustrate what that means, that how slavery to God can be freedom in its greatest form. If you look at Galatians 5:14, and if you look at Romans 13:9, those two scriptures, among others probably, but those two come to mind, that essentially illustrate, or partly illustrate, what's going on here and how that's even possible. And I might get the verbiage a little bit messed up, but Galatians 5:14 basically says that, now I'm trying to remember which one it says. It says the entire law is summed up. Oh, by the way, if you look at different translations, it might have slightly different verbiage, but the idea is going to remain the same. This verbiage is, I think, either from the NIV, New International Version, or the ESV, the English Standard Version, I think. I think they're mainly from the NIV, New International Version. But if you look in King James or the ASV, etc., it's going to say the same thing, just slightly different verbiage. But Galatians 5:14 says that the entire law is summed up in a single command. Because people tend to think that God is, like, believing in God, following God, means following a set of rules and requirements. And it can easily seem that way. You look at the Ten Commandments, you look at the Old Testament, etc. It seems like a lot of rules. I mean, the Ten Commandments in and of themselves is 10 rules, right? Until you actually look at the heart behind the rules. For example, if you're a parent and you give your kid a set of rules, are you doing it to control them or because you love them and you want the best for them? And you know what's best a lot better than they do. If you tell your kid to stay out, to not run in the street when they're playing, are you trying to control them? Are you trying to prevent them from having fun? Or are you aware of the dangers of the street? And you're aware that if a car comes and the kid runs out into the street, they could die. Or at least get badly hurt. And then you have a big mess on your hand. Parents know that a lot better than kids do. So when parents create those rules, that's just one rule. That's just one random, arbitrary rule. Could list, countless others. Are those rules there to prevent the child or prevent people from having fun and enjoying life, or is it for our protection because the parent loves the child? Maybe that's what it is. Maybe it's God loves us so much and He knows what's best for us. That scripture, the Galatians 5:14, again says the entire law is summed up in a single command: love your neighbor as yourself. Love your neighbor as yourself. What if these rules, these apparent rules that God has given us, aren't as much about control as they are about love and God knowing what's best for us? What if there's more to it than what we realize? I've arrived now, so I'm gonna take the camera again. The other verse that I mentioned was Romans chapter 13, verse 9. And I don't remember all the verbiage in that, but in that, the Apostle Paul is listing off some of the, I believe it's the 10 Commandments, maybe some other rules. And I don't have it in front of me right now, but he basically says, he starts listing them off. He says, thou shalt not kill, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, or murder, I should say, because killing and murdering are different. By the way, slight side note here. I used to think that there was a contradiction because the King James Version says thou shalt not kill. Killing and murdering are different things. There's a difference in motive. So I had a problem with that for a while until I looked into it more. It turns out that when the King James Version was written, they did not distinguish between killing and murdering. Murdering was considered killing, which explains that apparent, what appeared to be a contradiction. Turns out it wasn't a contradiction. It was simply a language issue. That's the whole idea of translations and languages and how language evolves over time is another conversation. An important one also, though. Very important one. It actually explains a lot of issues that people seem to have with the Bible and, again, other apparent contradictions and things that don't make sense. But this Romans chapter 13, verse 9, basically Paul is listing off the rules. He says, thou shalt not murder, thou shalt not lie, thou shalt not steal, and whatever other rules or laws, I forget exactly how he says it, but whatever laws there may be, they're summed up in this command: love your neighbor as yourself. Again, my verbiage might be, I might have the verbiage slightly off, but that's essentially what he's saying. He's saying, he starts listing the rules, and then he says, and whatever other laws there may be. So why does that matter? Paul didn't care necessarily what the laws were or what the rules said, because he knew that the heart behind the rules was loving people. Love, well, I'll just say. In other words, what if the law is not founded what if the purpose of the law is not to control us as much as it is because those laws are an illustration of what love looks like? Humans tend to have or can easily have a very messed up idea of what love is based on what we've been through in life and just the different struggles and problems that we've faced. Some of us have been through hell on earth, almost literally. And so we maybe have a very skewed view and twisted view of what love actually is. Maybe God's love is different from the human society's idea of love. Both those verses, and there's another one the other one that just came to mind was, I think, Galatians 5:13. But that's a different one. That actually is more related to the 1 Peter 2:16 verse. The 1 Peter 2:16 verse was the one where it said, live as free people, but do not use your freedom as a cover-up for evil. Live as God's slaves. That one's very similar to Galatians 5:13, and the exact verbiage I don't remember exactly, but Galatians 5, chapter 5, verse 13 says, see if I can remember it. It's you were called to be free, but do not use your freedom. Basically, it says, do not abuse your freedom, but serve each other humbly in love. I think I could be mixing up a couple different scriptures there, but the Galatians 5:13 basically says the same thing that 1 Peter 2:16 says, just slightly different verbiage. It says that we are free. God's people were created to be free, but that we're not to use that freedom as an excuse to do evil, but rather we're to serve each other humbly out of love. Not because we're forced to, not because we have to, but because we get to, because it's a privilege, because it's better to give than to receive, which is Acts 20:35, I believe. It is more blessed to give than to receive. When we start to look at different scriptures, things start to make more sense, and things that appeared as contradictions, maybe they aren't contradictions after all. Some of them are maybe paradoxes, apparent contradictions, but when you actually look at the heart of what's going on, they're not contradictions after all. How can God be loving and graceful and yet just at the same time? People will ask, well, and this there's a lot of different directions I could go with this, but people will often say, how can a loving God send people to hell? What if it's not that simple? Because the book of John, chapter 17, I forget which verse it is, I want to say 3 or 5, Jesus is praying. Believe it or not, Jesus prayed. That's another conversation as well. Jesus prayed, and he defined heaven. He defined heaven as eternity with God, essentially. That might kind of mess with some people's understanding of what they thought heaven was going to be. True worship is when we choose God. He gave us free will, believe it or not. So he actually doesn't send us to hell. And this is going to offend some people, and that's okay. People often say, if God is loving, how could he send people to hell? He doesn't. And this is going to sound ridiculous, perhaps to some. People choose hell by refusing and defying God. It says, and I forget where, somewhere in some book, somewhere in the Bible, it says, God essentially said, and again, my verbiage is slightly, probably not perfect, but it says, God takes no pleasure in the destruction of the wicked. God doesn't want anybody to live eternity outside of his presence, which is, by the way, the definition of hell, essentially, is living eternity outside of God's presence. Again, that might mess with some people's theology on what hell is as well. I think a lot of people have a twisted idea a twisted understanding of what heaven and hell essentially are. The Bible does illustrate a lot of these things if we allow ourselves to actually read what it says and not just what we want it to say. Maybe that's why it seems nonsensical, is because we read it. Another reason maybe why it seems nonsensical or can seem nonsensical is because we tend to read what we want it to say instead of what it actually says. What's an example of that? Let's look at Psalm 37:4, I believe it is. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Well, that's simple then, right? Because all I have to do is delight myself in him, and he'll give me whatever I want. That's what we want it to say, right? I get it. I've been there. The Bible, I'm a human as well. I'm a selfish human as well. So I get it. I've read it that way before. Oh, so I'll just find my delight in God, and he'll give me the things that I want. It's easy to read it that way, but that's not what it says. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. Maybe you could paraphrase that to say, delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you what you delight. Could maybe say that's a self-fulfilling prophecy. Find our delight in the Lord, and he will give us more of himself. That might mess with you a little bit. For a long time, that verse didn't make sense to me because I thought, as I just previously stated, I thought that it was saying that if I find my joy in the Lord, as ridiculous as this is now, thinking about it now, if I find my joy, it's like trying to manipulate God. If I find myself, if I just choose to get my delight from the Lord, then he'll give me whatever I want. It's kind of, even that logic alone is kind of ridiculous and nonsensical. Okay, I'm going to manipulate God, and if I find my delight in him somehow, then he'll give me whatever I want. Well, that's a contradiction in and of itself. Not the verse, but our mentality is a contradiction. Hope that makes sense. People are good at contradicting ourselves and at reading what we want to read instead of what it actually says. So what is, again, that verse saying? Delight yourself in the Lord. Find your delight and your joy in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. There's another verse, I forget where, I think in Matthew it says, or maybe elsewhere too, but I think in Matthew it says, draw closer to the Lord and no, it's not Matthew. I forget where it is. It says, draw closer to the Lord and he will draw closer to you. And again, I'm botching the verbiage, but that's basically what it says. Resist the devil and he will flee from you. Actually, I think that's in Peter, but whatever. Doesn't matter. You can look it up on Google if you want. Draw closer to the Lord and he will draw closer to you. You will find the Lord if you seek the Lord with all your heart and all your soul and all your strength. I think that is in Matthew. Delight yourself in the Lord, and he will give you the desires of your heart. So all these things can seem like contradictions, right? Until you actually look at the heart of God and what he's actually saying. God is a paradox. He exists outside of our time, and yet he's created time. He existed fully human, and he existed in fully human form in the form of Jesus Christ, and he's fully God, which blows up our mind because we can't comprehend that. We can't even really comprehend God in the first place because he's so much greater than what we can imagine and understand. Isaiah 55. If you want, you might be curious also to check out Isaiah. There's three actually I'll list: Isaiah 55, Isaiah chapter 55 verses 8 and 9, as well as Job. I want to say chapter 11 and verse 7, I think, and then Romans chapter 11 verses 33 and 34, I believe it is. They kind of say the same thing. Who can understand the mind of God? His ways are so much higher than ours. Who can fathom the depths and the mysteries of God? So for us to claim that the Bible isn't true just because it doesn't make sense to us seems kind of arrogant. And I just probably offended more people, and that's okay. I don't have a problem offending people. If you've seen my other videos, then you should know that by now. I don't have a problem offending people. So if this offends you, then sometimes being offended is a good thing because it helps us to get out of our comfort zone. Maybe helps us to question ourselves. I'm going to wrap this up hopefully in a minute or two. But if you read, I'd actually recommend anybody who thinks that if you really think the Bible is nonsensical and foolish and is just full of nonsense, that's your prerogative. You're welcome to think that. A Mark Twain quote is coming to me right now. He said, I may have it again slightly off, but I believe it was him, and I believe the verbiage was, "It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure to be true that just ain't so." It ain't what you don't know that gets you into trouble. It's what you know for sure to be true that just ain't so. In other words, the real danger is being convinced and knowing that the Bible's false and nonsense, and then being wrong about it. Finding out maybe at the end of your life that the Bible was true after all. If you think that the Bible's nonsense, I would encourage you, I would challenge you to read through it a couple times with an open mind. Not read what you want it to read or what you want it to say, but read what it actually says. I had to read through the Bible probably 2 or 3 times to really start making the connections and for things to start making more sense. A lot of it doesn't make sense to me still, but a lot of it does. Or I'll read something that I read maybe the first time and it didn't make any sense. I'll read it again later on, and then I'll come across another verse that illustrates what that other verse meant. I think that reminds me, I don't think I really talked much about that, the Proverbs 9:10 and the 1 John 4:18 verses where we talk about fear. What if we're talking about different kinds of fear? The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom. That's Proverbs 9:10, I think. And then 1 John 4:18 says there's no fear in love because perfect love casts out all fear. So how are we supposed to fear God if there's no fear in love? That's a contradiction, right? Unless we're talking about different kinds of love. What if, or fear, I'm sorry. Different kinds of fear. What if the Proverbs 9:10 verse, not chapter 9 verse 10, when it says fear is talking about a reverence? Oftentimes in the Bible when it talks about fearing God or the fear of God, it's if you look at the original language and the context, it's referring to an awe or a respect of God. Sometimes due to imperfections in our English language, etc., it was translated as fear instead of awe. And I guess you could use both words. Whereas the fear in 1 John chapter 4, verse 18 is talking about the kind of fear that maybe we think of, like I'm afraid of this happening, or I'm afraid of that guy, or like scared kind of fear. That's what 1 John 4:18 is chapter 4, verse 18 is referring to. When it says there's no fear in love. Perfect love can't have any fear at all, because it's just love. So we're talking 2 different kinds of fear. Which those kind of things, sometimes you can only learn by really reading and studying the Bible, sometimes a few different times. The first time I read through the Bible, I thought it was largely nonsensical because of all the apparent contradictions. And then I read it again a couple more times, started studying it more, started finding these patterns. And then things started making more sense. Not that they have to make sense, but they started to make more sense. And I started to realize, that doesn't mean what I thought it meant. And I get it now because these 2 verses help illustrate each other. I could give so many more examples. I actually started learning and memorizing scripture a while ago, and it's very much opened up my mind and my heart to what it's actually saying. Not just what I want it to say, but what it's actually saying. And after a while I realized, okay, these apparent contradictions, they're not contradictions. Sometimes it's a matter of perspective. For example, if I say, I'm going to the store, but if a guy at the store says, he's coming to the store, the same thing. 2 different perspectives. Otherwise, it's an apparent contradiction until you realize the perspectives that are involved. So there's a lot of different reasons why it can seem nonsensical and like it's full of contradictions, but it's actually not. I know this is probably not what people want to hear. A lot of people, at least, maybe. I would challenge you, though, read it. If it still seems confusing and nonsensical, maybe read it again. Ask for God's help. There's actually verses. The one I'm aware of is, I believe it's in 2 Corinthians chapter 3, I think. I want to say verse 4, but I'm probably wrong about that. But it talks about how, I think that's the one where it talks about the scales over people's eyes, and how basically our sin has made it so that much of this stuff is maybe impossible for us to understand, and that we need God's help to be able to see the truth. There's other scriptures, I forget where, I think in Corinthians, I don't remember exactly for sure though, or in Romans, where they basically says that we need God's help. His Spirit has to show us the truth, and without the help of His Spirit, it's going to seem like nonsense. So I would challenge you to not only read through it, but read through maybe a couple times and ask God to help you see the truth. And maybe even more challenging is to do it with an open mind and take a step back and look at it. Don't read what you, again, like I said, don't read what you want it to say, but read what it actually says, because those are often two different things. It might take some courage to do this, because it might challenge our selfish nature, and you might find out that your life isn't about you. It's about serving and loving others and loving God above all else. I hope this has been helpful and challenging. I'm sure it's been challenging for me. I get challenged every time I talk about these things, because it challenges my own nature, as I'm a selfish human as well, saved only by the blood of Jesus. But I hope this video has been challenging and helpful, enlightening if nothing else, and enjoyable and helpful. And I wish you really, I challenge you to accept my challenge. The choice is yours. Take care.